Okay, we are still on 4.3 aquatic food production, but we're going to be focusing in this screencast on wild fisheries. One of the very first things that comes to mind, and you've probably already watched a video on it, is tragedy of the commons. Tragedy of the commons is a term that is used in general for shared resources that are not shared well, and we tend to lose those resources because we're not using them in a sustainable manner. But it's very common to use tragedy of the commons with fishing because most fish don't pay attention to boundaries. So, if you have fish in the middle of the Atlantic Ocean, whose fish is it? So usually most countries can't claim that fish is theirs or that. So it tends to be more of a shared resource amongst different societies. And because of that, we've really experienced quite a bit of tragedy of the commons. So again, the idea of commons, it's a term used for a shared resource. So that could be air, water. It could even be when you're talking about clean, having to do with the resources that have been, are you recycling or are you throwing it in the garbage or are you littering? All of that common area, we work together to keep it clean. So if you throw your trash on the street, well, maybe that's just one person's trash, so it couldn't be that big. But if everyone threw their trash on the street, then we'd have a problem. But it's also shared resources like our forests and our oceans and the organisms within it. So if people are just acting in their own self-interest and they take more than their fair share or add more of their fair share of pollutants, then those commons get degraded. And so if we all do this, then we can't have sustainable commons anymore. And, you'll see quite a few of the examples with fisheries, but they're the commons because fish usually exist in international waters. And so here's a fun little comic. And soon no one eats. In our wild fisheries, more than 70% of the world's fisheries are fully exploited. They're in decline, seriously depleted, or too low to even allow recovery. This is kind of scary. And as I've said quite a few times, our oceans and our fisheries are quite in peril because of this idea of tragedy of the commons. We have overfished them. And why have we done this? Well, we have a lot of really amazing technology that we can fish very efficiently now, such as we can use satellites to find schools of fish. We even use sonar to be able to find fish when you move through. A lot of vessels use indiscriminate fishing gear. You'll just catch a whole bunch of fish whether you're going to use them or not. But the problem is that if you're catching fish that you aren't going to use, well, you might be taking out organisms that are part of a food chain that someone else is using. So when you're just pulling all of these organisms out of the water, you can collapse food chains pretty quickly. There's a lot of different types of fishing that's just terrible for ecosystem in general. We're going to look pretty closely at trawling and drag nets, which is absolutely detrimental. It's like clear cutting. There's other forms of fishing, like using dynamite, where it just kind of kills everything in the area. So, and people do that because if they feel like, oh, well, I'm just going to get more fish for me because someone else is just going to fish them anyway. So they're not thinking about the long-term health of recovering stocks. So how do we fish sustainably? Well, there's a term that we use quite a bit in fishing. It's called maximum sustainable yield. And sustainable yield itself is the natural income, right, that can be exploited without depleting the original stock. So if you have 10 fish and you fish 2 of them, and then 2 more end up, being born by the next fishing season, you have 10 fish again. Well, then you have been using that sustainable yield, right? So it's that natural income that you're getting from it, as long as that main stock that you originally started with, that natural capital, if that stays intact, then you're fishing sustainably. So for fish, it's how many fish you can take each year without decreasing your original stock. That's your stock is your natural capital, right? And maximum sustainable yield. So adding this word maximum to it, that's the highest amount that you can take without permanently depleting the stock. And there's a really nice video you're going to watch on the codfish that collapsed, and the Grand Banks cod, and they talk quite a bit about what this idea of maximum sustainable yield is and how they weren't paying attention to it. So, maximum sustainable yield. Do you remember this curve? This is from looking at populations. This is the logistic growth curve right here. And you can see here's carrying capacity, right? And so here's the initial, it starts to grow exponentially and then it slows down and then it hits carrying capacity. Well, maximum sustainable yield is half of carrying capacity. So this is when the species is at its biotic potential, when there's plenty of resources for those fish to eat, um, and it's not too polluted. So they can grow exponentially very quickly. So if you had, say, 500 fish in a population in a fish stock, you could hunt it down to, and that was its carrying capacity. You could hunt it down to say 250, and it should bounce back, right, back to the carrying capacity. So if you're fishing at maximum sustainable yield, that's what should happen. Well, carrying capacity and maximum sustainable yield is going to vary from species to species. It's going to depend on the reproductive strategies, how long they live, what type of resources are available in the habitat. But essentially, you definitely don't want to fish them down below maximum sustainable yield. Ideally, you're going to be somewhere in here. Okay. This graph is kind of cool because it's saying how much fishing effort you're going to put in based on your sustainable yield. So if you're fishing at maximum sustainable yield, you get a big giant yield, but it's going to be a little bit more effort than if you were fishing below it. Whereas you're going to have to put in a ton of effort if you've depleted the stock and get a lower yield. So this is just saying if you're overfishing sustainable yield, you're working really hard and not getting a lot of fish in return. Okay. So, do you remember how population growth? We can look at it's how much the population, how much is born, kind of natality, minus the number of deaths, and you kind of have growth and recruitment minus immigration. So, how many have come in through immigration and how many have left through immigration? So, when you're looking at a fish population, if you were trying to estimate what that population was, the more individuals that, if you add more than die or leave, then the population is going to grow. And if you only take that difference between the two, then you've got that maximum sustainable yield. And so you don't need to be able to apply these equations, but I'm just, reiterating this is where this is linked to population and the fact that you essentially need more individuals need to come or be born than die or leave if you want a growing population. Okay, so here's why actually fishing at what you think is maximum sustainable yield is a really, really bad idea. First of all, we often don't actually know what the population is. We're trying to count fish underwater, places that we can't go very easily, and it's already just an estimate. So we don't usually know enough about the population dynamics of the species. We don't know what necessarily all the age ranges are of the species that exist in the population because we know a younger population has more growth potential than an older population. And there's a lot of uncertainty too. Like, we're not quite sure what's happening often in the food chains as well. Like how many of the fish that are your fish that you're trying to, if you're fishing a fish that eats other fish and those fish are disappearing for some other reason, then you're going to have a more vulnerable population. So that could change what the maximum sustainable yield is as well. So you don't want to be, because we just don't know enough about the population dynamics, about the food chain. Is there something going on in the habitat? What is the response to global warming? There's just so much uncertainty of actually knowing what the population is and where the population is going as far as growth goes. So if you're fishing right at that perfect maximum sustainable yield line, anything goes wrong and then you tip the population and it's not going to recover the natural capital. So you want to fish somewhere, as we were looking at here, somewhere up here, because that way, if anything goes wrong, you're probably still safe in the maximum sustainable yield area. And you don't have to put in as much effort year to year. Okay. And what happens when we get it wrong? You're going to see a classic example when you look at the Grand Banks cod and the collapse of the cod fishery there in Canada. And it's hardly come back even to this day because it was just not sustained well. It wasn't fished well. And that was an international issue as well as one that was more local too. Okay. The strategies that can be used to avoid unsustainable fishing, here is the list, and I'm going to look at them in a little bit more detail. But you can use quotas. So, quotas are like saying, this is how many fish you can take. You're allowed to take this many. So, it's essentially setting limits so you can hit that sustainable yield number and not over it. There's also, you can restrict the types of fishing gear that gets used. So, the mesh size and what type of boats you're using, and, there's also some socioeconomic controls. Are you giving subsidies to certain fish species? Are you maybe making some that are worth less money? Are you taxing some? And then there's this idea of marine protected areas, and you're going to see a nice example of that on Oppo Island. Okay, so quotas. If we're going to evaluate quotas, scientifically, catch regulations super hard to do, and the reason why is because you got to find a way to count and make sure you're holding people accountable. It's almost impossible to be able to estimate how many fish you can take. Like I said, we don't know enough about the populations to say this is the quota. We don't know what the maximum sustainable yield is. And it's really, really hard to monitor because people are going to cheat. And you've got to have enough resources and manpower to get in there and figure out actually how many fish everybody's taking. Um, so some ways to do it is it can be easier just in general to keep boats out of the water, out of protected areas, and limit when they fish rather than putting the quotas on. Regulating gear. So mesh hole size is a big deal because if you have larger mesh holes, that means you're not going to catch the younger fish, which have higher reproductive potential in the future. Um, and this can make a pretty big deal in restocking the population. Also, you get less bycatch, so you're not going to catch other species that might be a little bit smaller that fall through in the nets. And this is actually easier to regulate because you can kind of go and check and make sure that the boats have the proper gear and not using illegal gear. So it's easier than counting how many fish everybody's pulling out. And then I had mentioned before about this bottom trawling and what a big deal it is in the bycatch that comes with it. And bycatch is catching fish or other organisms that is not what you're intending to catch. And so you end up often throwing it out. And bottom trawling is essentially clear cutting. You take a big old, generally beams with a net behind it, and you just drag it and pull up everything in it. And so you're not only getting the fish you want, but a whole bunch of other fish that you don't want, and they end up having to throw out because it's illegal for them to have it. And you've destroyed the habitat. Nobody can live there after that. This is what it looks like. So you can see it just dragging these big metal slats along and pulling up the bottom. This is what it looks like before, and this is what it looks like after the bottom trawl. So, yeah, it's not good. Socioeconomic controls I had mentioned. It's price controls and taxes on certain species. So if there's vulnerable stocks, you don't want to fish that anymore, but you can make incentives for other species to encourage harvesting. The downside of that is you got to make sure people are actually going to want to eat it. And of course, it costs taxpayer money. Something that we're finding is super duper effective is marine protected areas. And so what it is you put these protected areas in and it exclude boats from going in there, and that area is allowed to fully recover. And what happens is the fish that, when the populations get big enough, the fish start to leave the marine protected areas to seed other areas nearby. And those are the ones that you can catch. So you're kind of keeping this area protected, so you always have a stock of fish that can thrive in a protected area where you're not allowed to fish. And success is similar to other protected areas. They have to be big in size. You've got to have community support, research funding, all of that from what we were doing in the last conservation area. There's a really, really nice example that you're going to look at on Oppo Island. And IUCN says that we need to actually set aside 30% of our oceans if we want to keep our marine oceans safe and viable for the future. One thing that you should be able to do is identify and evaluate techno, anthro, and ecocentric strategies that we've kind of talked about a little bit to avoid unsustainable fishing. Just make sure that you can do that. And then one more thing about harvesting wild species is There are some species that get harvested where it's actually quite controversial. And there's a lot of ethical issues over biorights and indigenous cultures. And you're going to want to look into a case study about harvesting of some named species. That might be like shark fins or whales or seals. So take a little bit of time to find something that you're interested in and do a little background research. Okay, we'll do aquaculture in another cast.